Welcome to Khanversations. I'm Muqtedar Khan. Today I'm going to talk about the two uh, competitions that are going on for leadership of the Global South. One between China and the United States, and the other between China and India. But before I do that, please subscribe to Khanversations, like this video, press the bell icon, and don't forget to share it with your social network. On one hand, you see the United States competing with China to become the leader of the global south, especially in the African continent. The African summit that Biden hosted a few months ago was designed, in which he talked about investing $55 billion in Africa, was designed to compete with China, China's growing influence, China's growing investments, China's inclusion of many of the African countries in the Belt and Road Initiative, which clearly showed that China was gaining an upper hand, at least through investments and engagement. And because China's engagement comes with no human rights strings attached or demands for democratization, regimes are more willing to work with China rather than with the United States, where there's a constant pressure from the US government to reform politically and also take various political positions internationally. So, for example, right now, the US is pressuring all its allies to support Israel, whereas China is not. So there is, on one hand, a competition between the United States and China going on both in Africa as well as in Latin America, which are the two, along with Asia, two important pillars of the global South. But on the other hand, you also see another race going on between China and India to become the voice of the global South, to represent the global South in international forums. And in this year, in 2023, it appeared that when India became the chairperson and got the presidency of G20, it came up with a very strategic and smart move to host a virtual Voice of the Global South conference in order to basically understand what the core interests and issues are for the Global South as a whole, so that India could represent the Global South in G20 and bring as voice of the Global South the issues that the Global South cared for to the summit of basically northern countries, which is G20. So India found a very interesting and smart diplomatic move to do that. And then in the last week or so, it held a second summit in the same year of the Global South in order to consolidate the gains that were made by India in the G20 summit and through its G20 presidency. The biggest achievement, obviously, was to get a seat for African Union in that, like European Union. And so now it's essentially G21 from the next summit onwards. And India takes credit for it because A, it happened under its presidency, and two, because it played a major role in pushing that issue to be inclusive, to bring Africa into the fold. China, too, has been trying to become the voice of the Global South. It wields a lot of political influence in the Global South because of the Belt and Road Initiative, because of its huge investments. China is the biggest investor in Africa and Latin America, and also in many Asian countries, even in South Asia, for example. China is the biggest investor in Bangladesh, in Sri Lanka, in Pakistan, and other neighboring countries, I think also in Bhutan. Even though India is competing both in providing credit to Sri Lanka and also is quite competitive in Bangladesh. So there is this second race going on between China and India. But increasingly, India's political positions and its geopolitical alignment with the United States, especially through Quad, has created a disparity where it appears that more and more India is out of sync with the positions that the global South is taking, especially with with Israel's war in Gaza. So, for example, in the General Assembly's vote at the United Nations, where 120 countries voted and called for a ceasefire, India was not in sync with the global South. India voted with the United States and allies. India abstained essentially, but the abstain was like a no vote. And so it seemed that it was more aligned with the global north than the global south, more with Israel and the US than the rest of Africa, Latin America, and Asia, 120 of which voted to call for a ceasefire in the UN. And increasingly, you see that India's political positions are being more and more in alignment with the US and the West rather than the global south. So a few months ago, I think in the beginning of the year, the Pew Research Center did a study about perceptions of China and looked at about 23 countries and their views about China, which were more or less negative. But what was interesting that most of the countries of the global south had positive views of China, except India. India's pattern of public opinion as well as voting seems to be more aligned with G7 countries rather than G77 countries. But most recently, since the Israel-Hamas war began, we have noticed something very interesting, that even though China is really not doing much, it seems to be gaining a leadership status. For example, from the very beginning, China did not actually condemn Hamas. It did it later at the insistence of Israel, but it immediately called for a ceasefire and also talked about the two-state solution right in early October, while India was merely condemning Hamas. China was calling for a two-state solution. Then, after the casualties of citizens, civilians started dying in Gaza as a result of Israel's genocidal revenge war on Gaza, we saw India then reiterate its older positions and reaffirm its commitment to the two-state solution for a viable, independent, sovereign Palestinian state. Also, suddenly, India remembered that India was one of the earliest countries outside OIC to recognize Palestine as a state. India has embassies in West Bank, basically representation of the Palestinian state. And so India started balancing its position on that. But nevertheless, even in the G20 summit, which was held virtually, India did not call for a ceasefire, which is one of the most important claims that the global south is making: an immediate and enduring halt to violence and direct condemnation of the killing of thousands and thousands of civilians. While India is condemning the death of civilians, India is not condemning Israel for killing the civilians, especially over 6,000 children and 4,000 women. So in that sense, India has now become out of sync with the global south. So for example, if you see the BRICS virtual summit on this issue, Prime Minister Modi did not even show up for that. He sent Dr. Jaishankar, the foreign minister, whereas Putin as well as Xi Jinping spoke at that event. And that event, even though the countries that spoke at it had variations, it did not condemn Hamas. It condemned the deaths of civilians, called for an immediate ceasefire, and also rejected Israel's claim that what it is doing is self-defense. They did condemn the terrorist acts of Hamas, but what is important is that they insisted on basically calling for an enduring ceasefire and cease hostilities and moving forward on the two-state solution. One of the indications that China is perhaps sticking its nose ahead of India on the leadership issue in the global south is the importance that China suddenly is enjoying in the Middle East. See, China has two advantages over India. It has a huge economy compared to India, more than 5 times bigger than India. And so it's able to invest more than India in most of the global south countries, which are hungry for foreign investment and development aid. And because it has a strategic program like the Belt and Road Initiative, it is easy for countries in the global south to plug themselves into this. So this is a strategic advantage that China is enjoying over India when it comes to leadership in the global south. But one of the interesting developments was that In the past few days, a delegation of Arab and Muslim countries, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt, the OIC, Palestinian Authority, and Indonesia. This delegation has started visiting all the leading countries in the world, especially members of the UN Security Council. But they started their tour with China, then they went basically to Great Britain and France and Russia. So, so what they are trying to do here is basically trying to drum up support for basically an enduring ceasefire. And China once again is appearing as if it is playing a more important and more reliable role in the Middle East, especially after it basically hijacked the Omani and Iraqi process of bringing Saudi Arabia and Iran together. And then the peace deal kind of for normalization of relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran took place under the auspices of the Chinese foreign ministry in Beijing and trying to project China's image as a peacemaker in the Middle East. China has shifted its position very significantly away from Israel and more aligned with Palestine and the Palestinian cause. And with that comes immediate alignment with all of the OIC countries and immediate alignment with African countries and immediate alignment with Latin American countries. Some of the most vociferous critiques of Israel's genocidal war in Gaza are from South America. And so this particular issue where the US, India seemed more aligned with Israel and Britain and the US, India is losing out, I think, on being the voice of the global South. How can you be the voice of the global South if you are not aligned with the global South? How can India speak? So it appears that India wants to become the voice of the global South, but then rather than being, it then acts as if in its own self-interest. So the idea of leadership is to expand your self-interest in order to include the interest of the others. That's what you do. Like the US, when it talks about Ukraine, it talks about Ukraine's national security as the US national security, or Israel's security as US security. By expanding its own conception of what its national interest is, the US exercises leadership. So India in these summits does say that we want to be the voice of the global South and we are bringing them voices to the international, but then when it comes to its own interests, it finds itself completely out of sync with that of the global, so especially on geopolitical issues. So I think that India is more aligned on the desire for autonomy in foreign policy with the rest of the global South, but so is China. India is also aligned on the climate issue, on hunger issue, on other, shall we say, supply chain related issue. India is aligned more with the global South, but so is China on all of these issues. So I think India's geopolitical divergence from the global South as a result of basically its fear of China, which is driving it deeper and deeper into the Western alliance and closer to the United States, is, I think, going to, in the long run, undermine India's capacity to truly become the voice of the global South. India has to sustain its foreign policy autonomy, but if it's going to be dictated by Washington, and even if it looks as if India is more and more aligned with US and Israel, then India is not going to be a country that most of the global South on these critical issues will look towards India. On environmental issues, yes, and I think perhaps as a developmental model, because India is a democracy and China is not. Those countries in Africa and Latin America which want to make their own democracies more robust, India can get ahead of China. So I think going forward, one of the key things to keep an eye on will also be to see how these two competitions between China and US, China and India, pan out for leadership in the global South. The United States' credibility at the moment is very, very low in the global south. Especially its huge demands that everybody else sacrifice their national interests to advance, say, the interests of Ukraine in the Russia-Ukraine war, and now demanding that the rest of the country suspend their sense of morality, the sense of sovereignty, forget their colonial past, their history with colonization, and support Israel's genocidal war in Gaza. These demands that the US is constantly making of countries in the Arab world, in the Middle East, and everywhere, wherever Blinken goes these days, that is what he's demanding, is reducing the US credibility because, on one hand, the US talks about rule of law and talks about how whatever Russia is doing in Ukraine is genocidal, and then suddenly turns around and then undermines those same rules, those same international norms, and tries to defend the indefensible actions of Israel in Gaza. So in that sense, both China and India now have a credibility advantage over the US. So we will see how these two races eventually become one race. And so if India starts also competing with the US in being a leader of the global south, then what happens to India's strategic partnership with the US? Can it withstand a competition in the global south? So I think from a geopolitical perspective, these two races are quite interesting, and we will keep an eye on it going forward. And for all of you, please subscribe to Khanversations, like the video, press the bell icon, and don't forget to share it with your friends and your social network.